morning, everyone. It's great to see you. It's great to be here. Hey, my name is Reza Zadeh. I'm one of the teaching pastors here at Mission Hills, and I want to welcome you. Thanks for coming, gathering here in the auditorium with us as we're going to study God's Word, as we are encouraged through song, and we're challenged to be a part of allowing our lives to count through missions. This is a great morning, great time to be together. Thanks for joining us online if you're joining us online. Hey, before we start, I just want to say a thank you. I love being a part of a church like Mission Hills. I love being connected through social media, through many of you. And I've had a lot of people actually reach out to me this week and the previous weeks. I'm from Iran, and a lot of people have seen what's happening in Iran. And just let me know you're praying and asking questions. And I just want to say thank you for reaching out. Thanks for praying for the people of Iran who are protesting or out in the streets and really want to get out from under the injustice and the oppression that they faced for the last 4 decades. So thank you so much for just contacting and caring enough to pray. So I just want to start by saying that. But this week, we are continuing a series. We're continuing a series that Pastor Craig launched last week called Control Issues. And the problem with control issues is we've all got them. Like, I know we're thinking, this is really good. We're talking about control and people that have a white knuckle grip on life. And I'm so glad I'm here with the person sitting next to me because they need to hear about their control issues. Unfortunately, this is not for the person sitting next to you. This is for you, especially if you're thinking that. I'm really glad that you are here. Because we all have control issues, whether it's a fear of things spiraling into chaos or frustration, that life is just not going the way that we thought it would be. We're actually going to expose here in a little bit, we'll talk in a little bit, our control issues are always, and I mean always, I've been through enough counseling where the counselor says you can't use the phrase always. Our control issues are always stemming from the place of fear. Like, fear is the core of all of our control issues. And the problem with control issues is when we start to control things and try to have a white knuckle grip on our lives, on our children, on our relationships, on our jobs, on our interactions with other people, we are pushing God out of our families, relationship, careers, and everyday life. So we're actually going to be walking through the book of Exodus. We're going to take a look at the story of God's people. At the time, it was the Hebrew people in this book of Exodus. So if you have a Bible with you, I encourage you to turn to Exodus chapter 1. It's really easy to find. It's the second book of the Bible. So just go to the very left and just past Genesis, and you'll be there. So if you have a device with you, if you're here in the auditorium or you're online, you got a device, go ahead and go to Exodus chapter 1. We're going to spend the majority of our time in chapter 2. We're going to spend a little bit of time in chapter 1, just finishing that up, and Craig launched us in it last week. Let me just give us a very broad picture of where we're at. I'm going to overlap some stuff that Craig said last week to kind of make this smooth transition into chapter 2. So where we're at in the history of God's people, if you take a look at the last quarter of the book of Genesis, it centers around a character by the name of Joseph. Remember Joseph? He had the coat with a lot of pretty colors on it. Well, Joseph had some brothers who were pretty jealous of the favoritism that their father, Jacob, whose name was actually changed to Israel, that Jacob had with Joseph. And so because of their pride and because of some of the ways in which Joseph was favored, his brothers got jealous and they threw him into a pit. And from the pit, they sold him to some slave traders. And so Joseph was trafficked from a pit into Egypt. And through no fault of his own, we find him in prison. Well, because of God's sovereignty in his life, he goes from being in prison to the palace of Egypt. He actually becomes second in charge of all of Egypt. So he goes from a pit to the prison to the palace. And while he's in the palace, because of the ways God gave him some discernment and wisdom, Joseph is actually utilized by God to not just save the Egyptians, but to also implement some economic strategies that not just save the Egyptians from famine, but people around the whole region of the world at that time. And so God used Joseph in a significant way. So the Hebrews were actually able to come and settle in Egypt through Joseph and through some of the things that he did with the king. So there was this great relationship between the Egyptians and the Hebrews. Well, year after year, decade after decade, generation after generation, the Hebrews were in Egypt. They started finding themselves getting engulfed within the Egyptian culture. They were part of the culture, a part of the economy. They were working, they were living, they were kind of just wrapped into the Egyptian culture. Well, 10 generations had gone by, and there's a new Pharaoh in town. And the scripture tells us that this Pharaoh knows nothing of Joseph, could care less about how the Hebrews came into Egypt, doesn't have any regard for that original Pharaoh that invited them in, but this Pharaoh is actually worried and scared of the Hebrews. And in Exodus chapter 1, it tells us that this Pharaoh became so scared of the Hebrews that he wanted to oppress them. And so we're going to see how the control issues of this Pharaoh stemmed from this point to where they came from his fear of the Hebrew people, because they might grow and multiply and they might actually take over Egypt. So this is where we find ourselves. We find ourselves in a place where there is a Pharaoh, there is a king who out of his fear tries to control things, and out of control starts making some irrational edicts. I think that's one of the first points of control. When we try to control, we actually start to act irrationally. And one of the irrational ways that this king starts to act is he says, well, we're just going to wipe out the Hebrew race. We can't just perform a genocide and just kill everybody. So just little by little by little, we'll just do away with all the little Hebrew boys, the infant boys that are born. We'll just kill off all the infant boys. And then here pretty soon, after a few generations, there will be no more Hebrews because there will be no Hebrew boys. So the Pharaoh instructs the Hebrew midwives, and he says, when you go and when you kind of give, when the Hebrew women are giving birth, so it's almost like this, there was maybe some midwives that oversaw all of the Hebrew births in the whole region and in all of Egypt. And he would say, I want you to, whenever a baby boy is born, I want you to just do away. I want you to kill that baby boy. Well, the scripture says that the Hebrew midwives were like, well, we can't do that. So they actually didn't, because they feared God. So the Pharaoh calls them in and say, hey, how come you didn't do what I told you to? Like, I told you I want all the Hebrew baby boys killed as soon as they are born. And actually the response of the midwives is actually kind of hilarious if you look back. The midwives actually tell the king, they're like, well, Hebrew women aren't like Egyptian women. And I'm like, well, I'm not sure you should say that to the king. And they're like, Hebrew women aren't like Egyptian women. Egyptian women might take a long time for labor, but Hebrew women give birth vigorously. Like, that's what it says. And it says, basically they're like, they give birth too quickly. Like, we can't even get there in time to catch the baby. And so because of their fear of God, that's the excuse they give the Pharaoh. So the Pharaoh, again, dealing with his own control issues, acting irrationally, says, okay, well, there's something else that we're going to do. So here's where we find ourselves. That's a little bit of context for where we're at. Exodus chapter 1, verse 20. It says, so God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. So because the midwives didn't obey Pharaoh, and they didn't do away with all the baby boy infants as soon as they were born, it says that God was kind to them, the people kept increasing, and because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. So because of their fear of God, which I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about this, because if we're going to talk in a little bit how our control issues actually stem from fear, we should probably experience fear in the right way. There's a difference between fearing God and being scared of God. Like, those are two different things. Fearing God and being scared of God are two completely different things. Fearing God has to do with reverence. Almost this like experience is understanding that God is so holy that I have this reverent fear, this reverent respect of God Almighty because he is holy. Whenever I hear this phrase, fearing God, I oftentimes think of a mountain climber. I have never climbed the cliff of a mountain. Like, I just don't have the body type to like have ropes in my fingers like dictate whether or not I'm gonna fall. But I imagine someone that does rock climb, or someone that does like to boulder, or somebody that does enjoy the outdoors in that way, when they see a cliff with a really steep pitch, I am not sure they look at that and say, I'm scared of that and I'm not gonna climb it. The mountain climbers that I've talked to, like, they run to those types of cliffs. But if it's especially steep and they're about to climb that, I would guess they have this reverent fear of that cliff. That doesn't keep them from climbing, but it keeps them from making sure their ropes are tied tight, their carabiners are connected well, that their fingers and their footing is solid and secure, not because they're scared of climbing the mountain, but because they have this fear of falling away from the mountain, so they're going to be sure they're holding on tight and do everything they can to stay close to that cliff. You see, that's the exact same picture of what it means to fear God, having to do with reverence. And so because they feared God, God blessed them and gave them families. In verse 22, then Pharaoh gave this order to all the people. Again, Pastor Craig mentioned this. I just want to reiterate it. Every Hebrew boy that is born, you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. So here's the interesting thing about Pharaoh. The Nile was actually a source of life for the Egyptians. And what was a source of life, Pharaoh actually used as an instrument of death. That in our control issues, we act so irrationally that we even choke the life out of other people that we're trying to control. Couple of reasons I wonder why, Pharaoh would want to throw the Hebrew boys into the Nile. One, it was probably pretty clean and convenient, much cleaner and much more convenient than, taking care of the lives on the land, because it'd be pretty messy if that happened. But just like many other cultures in that day that lived along the riverbanks, it was almost a sewer system that the river would just get rid of what wasn't wanted in that community. So that was probably the first reason. It was a cleaner and convenient way of performing the genocide on the Hebrew boys. The second reason is the Nile was actually seen as a god. And so it was almost like Pharaoh was taking the pressure off of himself and the responsibility off of himself, and basically saying, why don't you throw the babies into the Nile? And if the Nile god receives the baby and takes the baby's life, well, it wasn't Egypt that did it. It was the Nile god who did it. You see, but the source of life actually became this instrument of death, that when you are wrestling and you are exposing your control issues on other people, you choke life out of them, but then you also go back on your most sacred principles and some of the things you hold dear to your life. So as we take a look at the story and as we walk into Exodus chapter 2, what happens next is it's pretty well known by a lot of people. You don't have to have grown up in church to have somehow, somewhere heard the story of Moses being born and his mother putting him in a basket and being in the water. And then the Egyptian princess, the daughter of Pharaoh, finds Moses and brings him into Pharaoh's household. Like, that's pretty common knowledge. We've heard it in different areas of our culture. But here's what I want to do. I want to utilize this story. I want to look at a central character of this story. I want to look at Moses' mother. How did she try to control the situation? How was her control issues exposed? And we're going to see towards the end of this story how she goes from a place of trying to white knuckle grip and control everything to actually come to this place of surrender and release and trusting God. So there's a lot of things that we're going to see in this, and really it's going to expose a whole lot of our parenting. And so I know some in here are parents. Some of us are not parents. Some of us are parents to young kids. Some of us have grown-up kids, adult children. Some of us want to be parents, not yet parents. We have this whole range of people that are involved here within our church. So whether you are a parent or not a parent yet, or maybe not a parent, that's not what God has for you, I think the principles in the story will actually still apply to the people that we influence, the children, the generations that we interact with in our apartment complex or our neighborhood or at work or church or wherever. So one of the things about being a parent is being a parent will expose our control issues like no other. Like, as parents, we worry about so many things, and rightfully so. Like, there's a lot to be concerned about. We want what's best for our kids. And we ask questions like, is my child in the right school? Do they have the right opportunities? Are they falling behind others? Like, is my daughter going to make the high school volleyball team if I don't start her out in club volleyball in second grade? Like, do I need to do that? Or what about my preschooler? Like, does he or she know enough numbers to be able to go to preschool? Does he or she, are they able to do addition or alphabet? Or like, we worry about these things. Or what about our adult children? Like, sometimes we wonder, is anything that we've taught them about God, is it even going to sink in? Are they ever gonna make the right decisions that I want them to make in life? Like, are they gonna marry the right person? Are they even gonna get married? You see, here's the core of all of this. The core of all of these things are rooted in fear. And the problem is, when we're fearful of things, we worry about them. Worry is simply fixating and focusing on something that hasn't even happened yet, but it's always fueled by fear. Worry is always fueled by fear. And basically what worry is fixating and focusing on something that hasn't happened, but we're anticipating that it might happen and it might be something that we are really scared of. So fear leads us to worry. Worry oftentimes leads us to control, to try to control situations because we're scared. And out of fear, we start to worry. And out of worry, we try to control. And you know what control actually exposes? A lack of trust in God. And when you don't trust God, it's impossible to exercise faith. You see the progression there? Like we're fearful of something, so we worry and fixate on it. And because we're worried and fixated on it, then we try to control it. When we control it, we actually show we don't trust God. And when we don't trust God, there's absolutely you can't trust God and have faith at the same time. And so we've got to get back, instead of just saying, have faith, have faith, have faith, which is kind of some of the ways that we've been taught, unfortunately, to grow in our Christian life. Hey, you just got to have faith. We actually got to go back to the root and understand what is it that we're so fearful of that leads us to that place. This is why so many well-intentioned parents and people end up being control freaks, because it's always rooted in fear. So let's take a look at how Jochebed, Moses' mother, handled the control issues of Pharaoh. And let's see this blueprint of what does it look like to examine, to expose, and exterminate the control issues in our lives. So I'm going to read through Exodus chapter 2. I'm going to read through the narrative of the first 10 verses, and we'll come back, and there's some fascinating things within the passage that I want to expose, to take a look at, because I think we're going to see our lives in this story more than we even think. Verse 1, now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months, but when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get one of the Hebrew nurses, Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? Yes, go, she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I'll pay you. So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. So here's what's pretty amazing about this passage. So the second book of the Bible, the Exodus, is actually a part of what's called the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Bible. It's pretty sacred, foundational writing in the Hebrew faith, but then also for our Christian faith. And the writer of the first 5 books of the Bible is Moses himself. That a lot of the stories that we read in Genesis, a lot of that was passed down verbally through generations. And then, of course, Moses had the experience of leading the Hebrews towards the promised land, and then all the things that we read in Leviticus and Deuteronomy and in Numbers. But Moses is writing this book, and Moses is writing this narrative about his life. And here he starts talking about these 3 women that God used to save a baby from death, whose motives were incredibly pure. These women that God used to do what women were good at and what their culture especially honored, preserving the life of a child. So as we look back, knowing that Moses is the one who wrote this, I think there's some things that we're going to see that are really going to stand out to us. Because again, my hope isn't that we just learn some good facts. It's not even that we just get rid of our control issues. My hope is that we would actually see how God has woven the golden thread of his promises within his story back here 3,000 years ago, and then also for us where we experience life now. It starts off verse 1. Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman. Let me just stop right there. The Levites are a tribe of God's people that come from Levi, one of the sons of Jacob who settled in Egypt. And the Levites actually become the ones who are going to stand in the gap. All the different tribes had a different purpose for God's people. The Levites, those that descended from Levi, were actually going to be the ones that stand in the gap between God's holiness and the sinful humanity. Essentially the priests. They were going to be the spiritual leaders. So essentially Moses starts off and he recognizes that he comes from the tribe of Levi, that from birth he was a chosen child that was set aside specifically and pre-qualified for service for what God was going to call him to do. And then the next phrase, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. Like, I'm going to nerd out for a moment, so please excuse me. Like, Moses is writing this. This is the 16th time that Moses uses this phrase in the history of God's people. 15 times he uses it in Genesis that he says of a mother, she became pregnant and gave birth to. This is the 16th and final time Moses uses this phrase. And there's almost this way of Moses like making this emphasis that he recognizes that his life was the final life that God was going to use to lead his people towards this country, this land that God had for his people called Israel. So he sees himself in this story. It says, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child. Now, who wrote this book? Moses wrote this book, and he's talking about himself. Like, man, I was one fine child. Like, no. A better translation of that isn't necessarily fine the way we look at it. A better translation is almost like his mom saw that there was a deep meaning to this child's life. Like there was a specific purpose. That's not to say the other moms didn't have affection for their babies, but there was something about this child that Moses' mother saw. So this translation was a fine child. A better translation might say longing to have him, having deep affection, recognizing something spiritually significant in him. She hid him for 3 months, probably hid him for as long as she could. You could probably hide a baby for 3 months in your home before anyone else really finds out. Enough to be able to nurse him, feed him when he cries, and rock him to sleep. And so we go on in verse 3, it continues. And it says, but when she couldn't hide him any longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put him on the reeds or on the bank of the Nile. Then we find that Moses' sister, Miriam, we find out that's her name later on, that she stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. So it's almost like Miriam's like watching, like whether she's watching from the banks of the river, watching from, like we don't know, but she is on guard and she's watching. Now, there's some significance found in this picture of Moses' mother and father putting him in a basket. Like, first of all, like Pharaoh said, throw all the baby boys in the Nile. And it's kind of funny because I'm wondering if like Moses' parents were like, okay, you never said he couldn't be in a basket. Like, we'll put him in the Nile, but we're going to keep him in a basket. Now, here's what else is interesting. Like, we know that the story of God's people, even looking back to Genesis, God is a God that leads his people through the rough waters. Like back in Genesis, you have Noah and the flood. Here you have Moses in the Nile River. In the future, and Moses doesn't know this just yet, but in the future, God's going to lead the Hebrews through the Red Sea as they escape Egypt. And so God is a God that continually makes a way through the waters. Now remember, Moses wrote Genesis, and Moses is writing this. And this phrase that we see, that she put him in a papyrus basket, papyrus was just the material. It was from the plants that were in the region. It was a papyrus basket. But here's where it gets fascinating. The word basket that is used here in Exodus chapter 2 is the exact same phrase in the language that is used in Genesis 6 for ark, for the ark that Noah had built, for the boat. So grab this picture with me, that Moses sees the significance of his life, and he knows the significance of Noah, that God had specific purposes and future for Noah and all of God's people, so he carries Noah through an ark, a boat called an ark. And here he sees himself as he's looking back on his life, writing down the words of Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. He sees the significance of his life, that God is preserving a way for God's people through the waters by putting himself also in an ark. But this time the ark is a basket. It's not a boat. And it gets even more fascinating because we see that they coat the basket with tar and pitch, and tar was obviously like a glue substance to keep the leaves, the papyrus leaves together. But it's the pitch that is used, specifically tar and pitch. If you go back to Genesis 6, you see that God had instructed Noah, when you build the ark, God gave him some specific instructions. When you build the ark, I want you to coat the inside of the ark with pitch. You see, pitch was a substance. It'd be almost like we look at like getting maple syrup or getting, a substance from a maple tree, a sticky substance. That's kind of what pitch would be. And pitch, when it dried, it actually became waterproof. So God instructed Noah back in Genesis 6 to coat the inside of the ark with this pitch, with this substance that made the ark waterproof. Now the flood represented God's judgment. So when Noah and his family and the animals were in the ark, God's judgment waters wouldn't touch them. They were protected by the pitch. In the Moses narrative that we're reading right now, the Nile River that was used for the death of the Hebrew boys, the water of the Nile wouldn't be able to touch Moses because of the pitch that was inside of it. That God protects his people through the pitch, first in Noah, secondly in Moses. And here's where it goes a little bit deeper. Let me just nerd out for one more moment and my nerding time is over. The same phrase, that pitch, is used one other time in the Old Testament. It's used in Leviticus chapter 17, talking about atonement. Atonement is just a spiritual word, just a churchy word that represents God, a payment for the sins of humanity. That just think about this. Think how God's story is woven through it. Pitch protected Noah and his family from the judgment waters in the ark, in the boat, because God had plans and purposes for his people. Pitch protected Moses in the basket because God had plans and purposes for his people and he wanted to use Moses. And our sins are atoned for, that we are actually covered in the atoning sacrifice of Jesus, that we are not, that the judgment of God can't touch us because we're covered by the blood and the sacrifice and the atonement of Jesus. And so first there was a boat called an ark that led God's people. Then there was a basket that was a type of an ark that led God's people. And now we also are in a type of an ark. But our ark is the cross. That because of the cross, we are protected from the judgment waters and the judgment that is to come. That's the beautiful way that God is weaving his story in the midst of all of this. And I don't think Moses writing this is missing this on purpose. I think he's specifically utilizing these phrases to communicate something. That God has plans and purposes, and God's plans and purposes will go forth, even when circumstances seem overwhelming. Now, I don't know if you've seen this story. I don't know if you've watched Charlton Heston and the 10 Commandments. I don't know if you watched Prince of Egypt, but I don't know about you, but I always had this picture of Moses' mom putting him in a basket, putting the top of the basket, the lid of the basket, and then shoving him into the Nile River and being like, all right, good luck, baby. I hope everything turns out well. That's kind of the picture I think that sometimes we have in the basket just so happened to go along a riverbank. I don't think that's how it worked at all. I think what actually happened is she put him in a basket. She did cover him, but I think there was a rope tied to the basket. And I think she would send that basket along the Nile and let it hide within the reeds. And when the baby needed, she'd pull the baby back and feed the baby and nurse the baby and care for the baby. And then when people came, she'd put him back in a basket and she would send him out. So I'm just guessing this went on for some sort of time. I have no idea, days, weeks, I don't know. But I'm guessing she didn't intentionally send him down the river and say, good luck with the crocodiles in the Nile. I think there was this almost this plan of I'm gonna keep caring for this baby as long as I can, and then I'll figure out what's next later. But in the midst of doing this, actually, we're gonna find that her greatest fear actually came true in verse 5. It says, then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe. So the princess goes down to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. I think that felt sorry for him. There was this sense of compassion that I think the princess had. Might have been a compassion because she knew what was happening to all the Hebrew boys. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. Like, I think that there is this picture of the princess actually recognizing this is one of the Hebrews. Like, my dad has made an edict that's pretty irrational. And I wonder if she recognized that he was a Hebrew. There's probably like a couple of reasons, 4 reasons why. Probably the first one is there was probably a physical difference between the Egyptians and the Hebrews. Like, physically, they were different. Maybe Moses was circumcised and Egyptians weren't circumcised. You know, we don't know. But later on, we're going to read that maybe actually Moses wasn't. And Pastor Craig will cover that in a few weeks. Or maybe she just saw that the baby was wrapped in some sort of clothing that represented the Hebrew people, maybe a specific pattern. Or maybe the fact that the discovery was in some sort of a Hebrew settlement area, or maybe just the general situation that the Hebrew baby boys had to be hidden. I don't know, but she recognized that it was an infant boy, and she cries out. And it's almost like she cries out, and I wonder if she was worried about the crying. And is he hungry? Is he cold? He needs to be cared for. I can't care for this baby. I can't bring the baby in because I haven't been pregnant. Like all these different thoughts and ideas. And here we see Miriam, Moses' sister, verse 7. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, hey, shall I go get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? Like she's got some quick thinking. And she's thinking to herself, this is it. Like this was my mom's greatest fear. She was trying to control everything. My mom's greatest fear has actually come through, but I think that God is making a way. And the princess says, yes, go, she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother, which is obviously her mother as well. So this is where we find it. So Miriam tried to control the actions here. And here's what I see. Could you imagine the horror of Moses' mother seeing this play out? Like she has tried to control the circumstance and situations any way she could to this point. And her greatest fear has actually come true, that Moses was discovered by Egypt. And I just wonder, because we're actually going to see in a little bit that Moses' mother actually hands Moses over to Egypt. That her greatest fear was that Moses would be discovered. But actually, through her greatest fear, we're actually going to see that she gets to a place of total surrender, and where she was afraid of Egypt finding Moses, but then she goes and hands her baby over. Like, what happens in that moment? I wonder if one of the first steps of us releasing control is us facing our fears. I wonder if facing our fears, like actually head on, when the thing we fear the most actually comes true, I wonder if facing our fears is one of the ways that God unchains us from our control issues. Like, here's the truth with God. Like, the truth with God is, like, we think if I walk with God, if I do God's purposes, that I'm never going to face problems in my life. But there's a lot of things that we fear. And what do we do when our fears actually come true? Like, how do we respond? And we find ourselves trying to control every aspect of our lives or our family or our children because we're fearful of these overwhelming circumstances. But what happens when that fear does come true? I think one of the things we get to do is invite God in, because with God, we are never promised a problem-free life, but we are absolutely promised a presence-filled life. Like, it's not that being with God means you're not gonna have any more problems. It doesn't mean you're not gonna have to face your fears. Sometimes where God leads you is straight into the pit or the prison or your greatest fears. But he leads us there to show us that he is with us through his presence. So this is where we find ourselves. So Miriam goes to the princess, says, hey, let me get a Hebrew woman. She goes and gets her mom. So now Moses' mother is actually able to nurse and care for her own child in safety. And I wonder if that's one of the things. I wonder if over the next weeks and months, maybe years, Moses' mother got to the place where she finally got to a place of trusting God. And in verse 9 and 10, we read the story that Pharaoh's daughter said to the mother, take this baby, nurse him, I'm gonna pay you. So the woman, Moses' mother, took a baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter. It doesn't say Pharaoh's daughter took him from her. She got to this place of trusting God. So my question for us is, how do we as parents get to this place? Like, how do we get to the place of fully trusting God with the lives and the decisions we make for our children? You know, can I be very honest with you? As a pastor, as a minister, as a chaplain, I spend a lot of time going to Children's Hospital in Aurora. Whether it's visiting families, you know, whose children are there, or it's taking athletes there to visit the children, no matter what it is, like I've gone in and out of there. I have a love-hate relationship with Children's Hospital. Like I love the work they do at Children's Hospital. And I hate the fact that they have to do the work that they do at Children's Hospital. Like walking in and out of there, even this last week, I was with the family who's in our neighborhood and their daughter goes to middle school with my 8th grade daughter and she was having a really intense surgery. So I drove down and, you know, just spent some time with the family and prayed with them. Like there's a lot that happens there. And there's a lot of people that I talk to and parents that I talk to that are learning what does it mean to fully trust God when the circumstances are out of your control. And unfortunately, some of the circumstances don't go the way we want and some of them go the way that we want. There's one family I just want to introduce you to. It's a family, this husband and wife. This family is literally, my wife and I, if we had heroes on this earth, like they are our heroes. When people say, who do you want to have dinner with, like in this world, like they're at the top. Like we love this couple. They were our children's directors when I planted a church years ago, the church that we pastored. This family's got an incredible story. Diane, mother and the wife, she was married to a gentleman named Travis. Travis and Diane had 3 kids. They have an older boy named Slate, middle girl named Hope, and a younger girl named Izzy. Well, probably about 18 years ago now, Travis was diagnosed with a cancer. He was diagnosed with a type of leukemia. And unfortunately, it became terminal for him. And in the moments, in the months and weeks leading up to Travis passing away, he approached his brother. His brother's name is Justin. So Justin, my kids are really young. I think they were all in the age of like 7 at the time or something like that. So my kids are young, they need a dad. Can I please ask you to raise my children as your own? Would you be a dad to my kids? Justin said, I'm gonna do it for you, brother. And so Travis passes away. About a year later, Justin, Travis's brother, ends up marrying Diane and starts raising those kids. Well, unfortunately, about a year or 2 later, middle girl Hope, she gets diagnosed with the same cancer that her father passed away from. So we prayed and unfortunately found ourselves at another memorial service. Hope had passed away. So I walked with this family through these 2 passings. And then about 4 years ago, both Slate, the older boy, and Izzy, the younger girl, they both get diagnosed with the exact same cancer that their dad and their sister passed away from. So you could imagine, I mean, the prayers and the thoughts and the, oh my word, and the tears and the crying and the anger to God. I mean, there's all that. Well, they went into remission and the cancer would come back. They went into remission. And unfortunately, 2 years ago, Izzy, the youngest, passed away from the same cancer. Now, Slate, the oldest, he's doing great. He's in remission. He graduated from CU Law School and he's doing good for right now. But I called Diane and Justin as I was preparing for this message. I was like, guys, I am preaching on this parenting thing on control. Like, talk to me about some principles that you would have. Like, what does it mean for you to release your control of your kids and release them to God? And so I'm just going to share with you the 3 principles that she shared with me. I think first and foremost, we need to release our children from our plans, our desires, and our dreams. Like as parents, we've got a lot of plans, a lot of desires, and I've got some really, I think if I was able to write my kid's story, it'd be a pretty awesome story. Like I've got some great plans, some great desires. Look, I'm Middle Eastern. I'm totally cool with arranged marriages, like all of that stuff. I want to control everything. But we have to release our children from our plans, our desires, and our dreams for their life. And allow God to expose his plans, his desires, and his dreams. Here's the unfortunate thing I see, and I see it all the time, that parents, we have a way that we allow our fear and maybe our insecurity to play out, not just in how we parent or the decisions we make, but what we push our kids to be involved in. And as much as we say we don't want sports to rule our kids' lives, guess what usually rules our kids' lives and our family schedules? Is sports. And so here's some hard things for us to understand of releasing our children from our plans, our desires, and our dreams. Second principle is this: remember that God will accomplish his purposes. That God has plans and purposes for our children, and they will. And the key word there is will. And I think a part of this is learning what it means to surrender to Jesus, because surrendering to Jesus means relinquishing authority. I think one of the reasons we wrestle with surrender is we think surrender means giving up, but we don't want to be people that give up. Like, I've taught my kids to never give up. Like, so I'm not going to surrender. But you know, surrendering, it does not mean giving up. I've said it before, and I'll say it, you've heard me say this before, that surrender is not giving up. When one army surrenders to another army, that's not saying that they're never going to fight again. It's not saying, oh, okay, we surrender, we're going to go be fishermen now. Like, no. It means they've made a statement saying we're surrendering being under the authority of this king, and we're just going to come under the authority of your king. The surrendering to Jesus is about relinquishing our authority. The third principle that Diane shared with me is this: parenting is not an individual sport, it's a team sport. And I'm not talking about your spouse, because this principle is true if you're married or if you're a single mom or a single father. Because we co-parent not with somebody else, we co-parent with God. That God is the one that we co-parent our children with. He is the one that God's plans and purposes are perfect, and they will be fulfilled in and through our kids' lives. And this happens best when, one, we recognize we co-parent with God, which leads us into some really good questions that we can ask ourselves as we parent and as we have conversations about our kids or our kids' schedules. I think one of the good questions that we can ask as we parent is this something that God is prompting for our children and our family? Or is it what I want from our child because I'm afraid? Maybe I was left out, and I'm going to make sure my kid's not left out. So if they struggle even a little bit in soccer, volleyball, basketball, we're going to get every private coaching they can because they can't struggle because I struggled. But are we doing things, making decisions for our kids, promptings for our children, our family because I'm afraid? And if that's the case, I'm not sure that's a good motivation. The second question is this choice that we're making based on what other parents are doing, or is it genuinely based on something that my child needs? Like, I think when it comes to control issues, one of the main reasons we control, it's a good reason. Like, we don't want our kids to suffer. But usually that stems from a place of deep within our story that we haven't allowed anybody else to expose or touch. And we start to put our kids, our families, our spouses, our relationships, our friendships, our jobs, others, our neighbors, we start to control every aspect of lives only because everything like that is rooted in fear. So what would it look like if we lived different? What would it look like if we examine what are we afraid of and how are they manifesting themselves in control? How do we as parents view our children, get to the place where Moses' mother was able to walk over to Egypt and hand her son over, knowing that there was great plans and purposes for his life? Friends, would you pray with me? Lord, thank you so much for this time here. God, I pray for all of us that we would get to a place of surrender and trust. The Lord, we would get to a place where we relinquish our authority over our lives and over the lives of our children, those of us who are parents. And God, you would continue to lead and guide us in our next steps of learning what it means to be more like you and to join you on mission. So I thank you for some of us that just need to take the next step of surrender, to just pray a prayer like this. God, I recognize that I've had a white knuckle grip on my life and the lives of others. I need your help, God. Holy Spirit, I ask you would help me release that grip, but you would remind me that it all starts with me actively surrendering to you, Jesus. So here I am, surrendering, giving you full control and authority of my life. Amen.